Let's go to Melbourne now and catch up with Liberal federal MP Katie Allen. Thanks for joining us, Katie. First up, I just want to ask you whether you sense, as a Melburnian and a federal politician, that the Andrews government is on top of the situation. We know about the mistakes of the past, but are they getting on top of the situation now? Do they have the confidence of people like yourselves and other Victorians?
Look, Chris, I have to say I certainly hope so, because Melburnians and Victorians are taking extraordinary steps, now going to stage 4 lockdown. There's been a lot of confusion, a lot of anger. Finally, we're seeing a level of acceptance that Daniel Andrews and his team need help. They're now accepting help from the federal government and other states. But I have to say there's a deep sense of dismay and disappointment about this disaster.
The issue here is finding out what's gone wrong is central, because you can't afford to repeat the mistakes. Now, we know even after he announced stage 4 lockdowns and a curfew, he still hadn't passed a rule where infected people had to stay home. He was still letting them go out and exercise when they were infected. So the problem here is that he hasn't got the basics right before he shut down the whole state.
You are absolutely right, Chris. We're seeing mistakes really right across this pandemic, which are incredibly disappointing. I had a colleague text me from Hong Kong saying, why on earth do you have one set of rules for hotel quarantining where you can't leave the room versus another set of rules for home quarantining?
She'd gone on the website and seen, as has I, that you could leave home when you were in quarantining to exercise. Now, how ridiculous is that? That has now changed, thank goodness. I am hopeful that we finally have got to the point where we're straightening this situation out, but it has been absolutely diabolical. Don't get me going with regards to the strategy for tracking and tracing. As the Federal Minister has said, Greg Hunt, we need to track and trace every case every day. I want to hear that at the press conferences, not that he's doing large amounts of indiscriminate testing, that he's testing whole postcodes where, quite frankly, I've heard from friends on the north side that they have not actually even received their results 4 and 5 weeks later from this indiscriminate testing. What's the point of doing testing if you're not telling people results? Most importantly, we need precision testing. We need tracing and tracking of the cases. And quite frankly, I feel the public have a right to know about things like the genomic testing. Yesterday we heard Daniel Andrews again saying, well, I don't do the testing. Well, you are in charge of this epidemic response here in Victoria. You should be asking those questions. If you don't know, let us know and find out.
Well, this is the problem, though. There's been so many mistakes. We know quarantine was a disaster. You mentioned contact tracing has not been good enough. People have waited too long to get their tests back. And up until this week, infected people were told they could leave home for exercise. Yet in the meantime, he's been locking down public housing people, he's locked down suburbs, and he's now locked down the whole of Melbourne and put in a curfew. Someone needed to get these other basic remedies and precautions right before applying this sledgehammer that's going to do enormous social and economic damage to the people of Victoria.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of an ideological approach about one size fits all. We know that targeted testing has been the way to do it. We can see the difference in New South Wales, where Gladys Berejiklian has a crack team where she gets down and gets testing down and gets every case every day. She's been using the COVID Safe app. We can see chalk and cheese between a government that knows how to contain something versus one that seems to have a bit of a one-size-fits-all to targeted testing instead of actually getting out there and getting the cases and identifying them in a timely manner, because people don't necessarily know they've got COVID unless they get the test, or if they've been in contact with COVID, they need to quarantine for 14 days. I still hear people saying, I've been in contact with COVID, I need a test. And I say to them, if you've been in contact with COVID, there could be a 14-day period before your test becomes positive. Meanwhile, you need to go into isolation until you've had your test, which will be 11 days after contact. That message seems to be very confused amongst the public. It's important, if you've been in contact with a known COVID case, you need to go into isolation and make sure that you then get testing at the 11 or 12-day mark before you come out of quarantining.
Well, you know this stuff backwards. You're a medico yourself. The problem here is that Victoria has totally stuffed it. Let's leave the politicians aside for a moment and look at the Chief Medical Officer, Brett Sutton. Obviously, his capabilities here have got to be questioned. Should the federal government step in? Should they offer one of the Deputy Chief Medical Officers from Canberra to come down and try and sort this out?
Look, I wouldn't want to comment on a public servant's situation because I think that for all intents and purposes, we're all trying to make a difference and the public servants are public servants. So let's
Sure, he's doing his best. What I'm suggesting is Canberra ought to offer some assistance.
Well, there's no doubt that there's a lot of assistance now being offered and there has been change to personnel. So there is now an engagement between federal and government leadership that we're seeing a change to the leadership in that public health response, and it is being required. And I would like to see, we're seeing new staff coming in, new personnel who've got the expertise to run this properly. So I welcome that. And I have to say that there's been some really serious problems happening here in Victoria. But yesterday, watching the press conference with someone saying, I take responsibility. What are you taking responsibility for? Please just give us the answers, because if we're going to go into stage 4 lockdown, we're going to be doing what we're doing. You need to be doing what you're doing. So we want to be sure that the track and tracing is happening properly. We want to be sure that the department is doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is delivering the services to keep Australians safe.
Spot on. It's the answers we need from Daniel Andrews, not this promise that he'll accept accountability sometime down the track. Now, there's been a manifestation of the public frustration in Melbourne today. It's come through the former prominent national news reading identity, a prominent Melburnian in his own right, George Danikian. He's put out a YouTube video and started a petition. Have a look at this.
Mr Premier, how is it that you've failed your constituents so dismally? Can you tell us that? Every Victorian deserves to know. Victorians have lost faith in you and your government. Now, we've been asked at The Informer to start a petition. There are Victorians now who want to be out. They want you out of office and they want Victoria to be declared a territory and to have the federal government take over the reins.
Katie Allen, George Danikian suggests that Canberra should take over, that the state government's not up to this. There's a bit of common sense in that approach, even if it's constitutionally very, very difficult.
Look, we don't have some sort of spare government that we can just roll in at this point in time. We have to make sure that we deal with what we're dealing with right here and now. We can't pause it for any other reason. We're in the middle of a crisis. Our numbers in between 300 and 700 every day. We're worried that they're going to rise. This is not the time to change teams at this point. That's not to say I think we need to change teams in the very near future. But at this point in time, it's up to the government of the day to deliver. And I'm very pleased that Daniel Andrews is working closely with Scott Morrison, because we need to deliver not just for Melburnians and Victorians, but right across Australia. So Scott Morrison's been very clear. He stands by ready to help. We finally have seen Daniel Andrews is accepting that help, and I have much more faith that we're going to be able to get this pandemic under control and contained here in Melbourne.
Yeah, the thing is, Scott Morrison's been very tolerant and cooperative, I think, but perhaps to take the politics out of this, Daniel Andrews needs to try and get the state opposition involved. It might be a time for a Team Victoria approach.
I absolutely agree. At the end of the day, the questions that are being asked by the opposition, and I've spoken to so many of my state colleagues, they're asking the right questions. This is not about playing politics. It's about accountability. And there's absolutely no doubt that things have been going wrong, but those questions have been asked for many weeks now. And the fact that even on June the 24th, there was an offer of 1,000 ADF being made by the federal government. It took a number of weeks before that offer was accepted. These are people, the ADF are a military precision testing team. They understand logistics. They understand how to get things done. And most importantly, we're now seeing a movement from paper trails to digitalisation of this response, because I understand that a lot of what has been done is being done manually. We need a much slicker operation, and that is now starting to be rolled out, and we're getting the professionalism that we need to solve this problem.
Katie Allen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Chris.
What a difficult situation there in Victoria. Good to see George Danikian back out and about. We'll try and catch up with him next week. I think I used to work with George many moons ago at Channel 10. A lot of you will remember him from Channel 9 and SBS, but he's had enough. He's getting Victorians on board with that petition.